Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kyle Peterson and Monet Ukwe-Barua, and we're talking about the age issue with President Biden coming to the fore here with some new urgency. And Kyle, you made an interesting point about the collective action problem for Democrats. Nobody wants to be the first mover to challenge President Biden, even though they might see that there's a window here for them to do it or an opening for them to do it. And Monet, RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson still doing probably between 25 and 30% in the polls, which suggests, I think that's not because they think, geez, I'm going to vote for Marianne Williamson. It's because they're proxies for somebody else other than this president. But RFK Jr. could do some damage to President Biden, say in the New Hampshire primary. Remember, the Democrats have basically eliminated Iowa, the Iowa caucus, as a factor. So the first voting test in the primaries will be New Hampshire. And then the other issue, which gets to the collective action point, is Kamala Harris, the vice president, because her approval rating in a poll I saw last week is only 37%. That's lower than President Biden's, which is sort of 41, 42, I think, in the same poll. And the Democrats, I think, are worried that if President Biden would voluntarily withdraw from the campaign, they might be stuck with the nomination of Kamala Harris. Now, I'm not sure of that. I think that a lot of other people would jump into the race. But if he withdraws late, say a year from now or in February after a jolt, say, in the New Hampshire primary, that would put Harris in a much stronger position than the others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on that first point about a potential Democratic primary, Biden certainly would be very weakened by facing any kind of well-organized opponent. Right now, as you have said, we have RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson. RFK Jr. certainly has the edge in terms of name recognition, and coming from the Kennedy clan, he also is sort of adorned by a certain amount of seriousness, despite the fact that he does say kind of off-the-reservation things now and then. But he could chip away at Biden's support, embarrassingly expose Biden's lack of consolidated support among the Democratic primary base. And so I think that that's something that, as we get closer to the beginning of the primaries, the White House is going to be working behind the scenes to really try to avert, to make sure that the potential list of challengers doesn't expand and that the ones that we have, that their campaigns remain marginal and without much support. Otherwise, it will subject Joe Biden to a long and damaging process. With regard to Democrats' plan B in the event that Biden is forced to withdraw from the campaign at a late stage, I do think that a lot of the potential challengers, and again, I mentioned Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer as two of the likely ones, are on the one hand very, very careful about not signaling that they're actively preparing. They don't want to suggest that there's disunity within the campaign or that they're being opportunists wishing ill to President Biden and his health. But I do think that they and others probably do have some sense of what the game plan would be, and that there probably would be a pretty open reckoning among Democrats about whether they're going to stand up Kamala Harris as the successor or whether they'd consider an alternative. My money would be with considering an alternative. Kamala Harris has shown herself to be a very ill-equipped vice president, very unpopular, and I think Democrats know that her odds in a general election campaign would be much weaker than some of the other potential candidates. And so you might see a lot of motion around consolidating around an alternative if that were to happen.
We had a visitor from a Democratic governor recently, I won't say whom because it was off the record, made the observation that J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, would be well equipped to jump in the race, maybe with a head start because of his personal fortune, be prepared to throw $200 million into the race at the early opportunity, which would certainly be an advantage over some of the others. But I suspect that Kamala Harris, as low as she is in the polls, particularly if Biden withdrew in early 2024, and I'm not saying he will, but if he did, I think she'd have a considerable advantage just by dint of being vice president. And she's done a lot of campaigning. She's got a lot of chits, Kyle. And the White House is now undertaking what I would call one of the more extraordinary political rehabilitation campaigns I've seen. I mean, they are bringing in the press to cover her. She's strange new capacities. She's really making a difference. They've taken her off the border beat, which was a loser. She's now on the abortion beat. She's talking about abortion at every chance she has. And that'll consolidate a lot of support among Democratic women. And that would not be easy to defeat. I don't know what you think, Kyle.
Yeah, I think she would have some advantages, but I think it would be a pretty open field. I would guess that you would get others up on that debate stage, and a lot would ride on how they performed, how their campaigns went, and then if there's any sort of effort by party grandes to consolidate the field. That was one of the more remarkable moments of the 2020 primary, when President Biden and Bernie Sanders were duking it out, and then in one day, Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg dropped out and basically endorsed Biden in unity because that's what they thought was best for the Democratic Party. That's what they thought had the best chance of defeating President Trump. And it's possible you could get a moment like that, too, where funders, donors, party brokers decide that Kamala Harris is not going to be the ticket to defeat President Trump, for example, if Republicans look likely to nominate him and they settle on somebody else. And at moments, the Democratic Party seems able to solve the collective action problem in a way that I think the Republican Party struggles to. That doesn't mean they necessarily will this time around, but it has happened before. And you have to wonder whether there are some of those party brokers that are whispering into the White House's ears right now, especially after this fall, that we need to have a talk with Joe.
Well, that will be fascinating to see. I mean, I think that is a possibility, that kind of reckoning later this year. Of course, the president wants and his aides want to project the image of competent governance in control for as long as possible. But I don't think this is a done deal in terms of his running for re-election. We've talked about the politics a lot here, but I think on the merits, Monet, I mean, I have met every president in office or afterwards since Nixon, and it's a very hard job. I worry just for the country of having a president who is 82, he'll be 82. If he wins a second term, having to serve for 4 years, and he's not going to have it any easier in office. And notwithstanding the White House attempts to give him an easy schedule, he rarely has events after 4 p.m., for example. He comes in and kind of late in the day, 9:30 for a president to start. Trump also started late, but I'm not so sure that Joe Biden wants to be compared to the work habits of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump was a night owl and stayed up all night, made phone calls at 1, 2 in the morning to people. But he's also going to be aging, and I worry about him and the job as well. Never mind the other things about Trump, but just strange things happen. You can decline fast. As you get older, and people age differently, but as you get older, the chances of something going wrong increase enormously.
Of course, and I think that all of those harmful effects of Biden's age are apparent both in stories like the Times piece, but also to the naked eye for anyone who is regularly watching the news and sees him performing in public. It's very clear that he is not as plugged in as previous presidents. And during the general course of governing, that means a lot of decisions are being made by his staff, and particularly Ron Klain, followed by Jeff Zients, probably have had a lot more influence on making policy decisions than chiefs of staff normally would, because Biden just does not have the breadth of attention to focus on all the issues that the president is in charge of the way that a lot of his predecessors have been. The biggest liability, as you said, is in those crisis moments when the president has to react and act as commander-in-chief of our armed forces and talk to world leaders, in part because those are sudden episodes that you can't completely prepare for, and in part because there are certain decisions that the president himself has to make. He's going to be in the Situation Room with his staff. There's no way for him to completely delegate those decisions to his staff in those moments. He has to be sharp and he has to be alert. Thankfully, I don't know if there's a clear episode where Biden's incapacity has led to a blunder in one of those situations, but it's certainly possible, and there's definitely no lack of challenges around the world that could cause a moment like that. But I do think that you're right that President Trump also, has some of the same concerns. He was not quite as losing his faculties clearly as Biden has been in his term. But President Trump definitely has slowed down since he was younger, definitely made blunders in public, and I think voters ask the same questions. But I do think that we live in such a politically polarized time that when it comes to a general election, people are just going to revert to supporting their side. The opportunity really is in a primary for a younger candidate to make the case that I'm better suited. But when it comes to a general election, I think people will say, yes, the age is a problem, but supporting this person is much more important because we can't possibly give the reins of power to the other side. And so that really means that the opportunity to shuffle either of these guys off stage is going to come during the primary cycle.
All right. Thank you. You get the last word, Monet. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Monet. Thanks, y'all, for listening. We'll be back, as we are every day, here on Potomac Watch. And this week, we've got Chris Christie and Mike Pence getting into the presidential race, and we'll talk about that in the days to come. Thanks for listening.